That's spelled O-U-I-M-E-T-T-E. He is 52 years old and has 19 years of service with the Tempe Police Department. On Wednesday, and I'm going to rehash a little bit of the information that happened. On Wednesday at about 9:07 in the morning, we received a 911 call from the Walgreens pharmacy located at Guadalupe and Rural Road. That 911 call was given that it was an armed robbery, that there was an individual that had just gone into the store. He had put on a ski mask and robbed the store with what was believed to be a handgun. The description that we had was a black male, 6 foot, thin build, wearing a dark shirt, gray sweats, sneakers, wearing a ski mask. What the investigation revealed is that when the suspect, who's been identified as Dalvin Hollins, entered the Walgreens, he walked near the bathrooms, at which point he put on a ski mask, went over to the pharmacy, at which time he jumped over the counter. When he jumped over the counter, he had a black bag. He began simulating as if he had a weapon by putting his hand in the bag, telling people, the victims, there were 3 victims behind the pharmacy, at which time he began threatening to kill them. He, at that point, demanded liquid narcotics. He stated he wanted a narcotic called high-tech, which has been identified as promethazine codeine. The victims handed over the liquid narcotics, and they, at that point, were believed that he did have a handgun. Once he was given the liquid narcotics, Mr. Hollins left the Walgreens and fled on foot. There was a customer that attempted to follow Mr. Hollins. He began following a vehicle which happened to be the wrong vehicle, but gave some pertinent information. The information that was given to our officers, first of all, that this was a priority 0 call. Here in Tempe, what a priority 0 call is it's a violent crime that had just occurred. When we have a priority 0 call, any available unit, any available police officer responds to the scene. And those are all typically for violent crimes. The information that was given to the officers was that he was a black male, again, 6 foot, thin build, wearing a dark shirt, gray sweats, sneakers, wearing a ski mask, carrying a black bag. There was an officer that was coming to the scene. He was traveling southbound on Rural Road. When he was approaching Guadalupe, he saw an individual, Mr. Dalvin Hollins, at Guadalupe and Rural. This officer attempted to contact Mr. Hollins, got out of his vehicle, his patrol vehicle, and asked if he could speak with Mr. Hollins. Mr. Hollins stated he did not want to speak with the officer. As the officer attempted to go near Mr. Hollins at that point began running away from the officer. He began running northbound on Rural Road through the parking lot. At that point, Lieutenant Ouimet was approaching the scene of where the officer was. He was going westbound on Guadalupe, approaching Rural Road, when he also observed the Mr. Hollins. When Lieutenant Ouimet went to the area where Mr. Hollins was being contacted by the officer, he saw Mr. Hollins running from the officer, at which time Lieutenant Ouimet attempted to contact and get as close as he could to apprehend Mr. Hollins. Mr. Hollins at that point ran into a southern parking lot of the Senior Living Center right there at Westchester and Rural. When Mr. Hollins ran into that southern parking lot, he cut in towards the senior living facility. Lieutenant Ouimet jumped out of his vehicle and began chasing him on foot. At that point, Lieutenant Ouimet stated that Mr. Hollins began running towards a higher level care portion of the facility. There was actually an employee that saw Mr. Hollins running towards the door with a police officer chasing him. At that point, an employee hit a switch that locked the doors. At that point, Mr. Hollins continued to run westbound through the senior care facility, the outside of the care facility. At that point, Lieutenant Ouimet began paralleling the suspect, Mr. Hollins. He began yelling commands for Mr. Hollins to stop. Mr. Hollins did not stop, at which point Mr. Hollins turned towards Lieutenant Ouimet and pointed what Lieutenant Ouimet believed to be a gun. Lieutenant Ouimet at that point moved out of the way and fired one round striking Mr. Hollins. Lieutenant Ouimet did not know at that point that he had shot the suspect and had hit the suspect, but Lieutenant Ouimet fell to the ground, injuring his arm. After being shot, Mr. Hollins then continued to run westbound through the parking area, through the facility, the exterior of the facility, and ran into a storage shed. When he ran into this storage facility, it's a maintenance shed. There were two maintenance workers that were currently in the shed at that point. They saw Mr. Hollins run into the shed. One of the employees was struck by Mr. Hollins as he was running into the shed. He was hit in the chest with the elbow, and both employees ran out. Both employees believed also that Mr. Hollins had a gun in his possession, as they stated, he had his hand in the bag as if he had a firearm. When they came out, they told the responding officers, where Mr. Hollins was at. They stated that they did believe Mr. Hollins had a firearm and that he was in a storage shed. There was a large police response. There were several people that lived in the facility there that were evacuated. When they were evacuated, they were taken to different portions, different areas, some of them to the Albertsons, some of them to another facility, and we also called in city buses to bring in as many people as possible. When the officers arrived, they were able to isolate where Mr. Hollins was at. He was in an area that he could not exit. There was only one entry and one exit. When Mr. Hollins was in there, we surrounded that area and we began making commands for him to come out. We began calling him out, trying to get any kind of response, which we did not get. It took about an hour for our tactical unit to get there. When our tactical unit did get there, they began putting other methods of getting in there, one of them being a robot. We sent a robot in there, at which point we did find Mr. Hollins unresponsive, and we attempted to contact him with our tactical team at that point. When we went in there, we saw that he was unconscious. We began medical treatment, called in the Tempe Fire Medical Rescue, at which time they came in and they pronounced him deceased. At this point, that's some of the information we have. Real quick, before I turn the time over to Chief Moyer, you're going to get a CD. On this CD, there's going to be several pieces of information that many of you have requested, including the Walgreens pharmacy surveillance video of the robbery. There's a business surveillance video of Mr. Hollins walking down Guadalupe at Guadalupe and Rural. There's also 2 911 calls. One of them is from the Walgreens, the employees there that were robbed. There's also a 911 call from the witness, and in that witness call, you're going to hear that they were chasing the wrong car. Also, you're going to get attached the media release, as well as our Tempe Police body-worn camera policy, and a photo of Lieutenant Ouimet. At this point, I am going to turn it over to Chief Sylvia Moyer. If you have any questions, please hold them to the end, and we'll take a few at the end.
Thank you. So the events that bring us here test us as a community. First, as I said when I spoke with Mr. Hollins' mother, Sarah, I expressed to her then, and I express it now, my profound sadness at the loss of her son. I have offered to meet with her and discuss everything that we know. She said at that time that she would consult the family and call me and let me know when it was a good time for her. I honored her wish. I have communicated with the men and women of the Tempe Police Department and told them that regardless of where the facts lead us, we must remain unafraid to fulfill our daily duty to safeguard Tempe. That people of Tempe, whether they live here, do business here, have fun here, study here, whatever brings them to Tempe, they're counting on us. We will, I told them, endure scrutiny, and we will learn from this tragedy, but we will learn humbly, and we will admit where we stumbled. I've committed to being the honest and open chief that Tempe and the profession of law enforcement deserve. In furtherance of this commitment, I will address some key questions and points of general interest to everyone. First, is following the shooting scenes being stabilized. As described by Lieutenant Pooley, our investigation began immediately. 3 victims at the Walgreens robbery site, 1 victim assaulted by Mr. Hollins at the adult living complex in the maintenance shed, and our Lieutenant Ouimet all perceived that Mr. Hollins had and would use a firearm. Lieutenant Ouimet expressed that he was very concerned for the safety of the residents in that community as he made his decision to shoot. An extensive search was conducted and no firearm was recovered. Lieutenant Ouimet was wearing a body-worn camera. He was wearing it during this incident. However, our lieutenant did not turn on that camera, thus capturing Mr. Hollins, who, while fleeing, turned toward Lieutenant Ouimet in a manner that Lieutenant Ouimet perceived as preparing to fire. It was in that moment that Lieutenant Ouimet had to respond.
You've been listening live to Tempe Police Chief Moyer talking right now about the police briefing of a fatal shooting of an unarmed black man. It happened earlier this week, and there were a lot of questions after we heard from the suspect's mother earlier this week saying she hadn't been able to see her son's body and admitting that he had a drug history but was being treated for mental illness. They were asking the question, the family asking the question, where was the gun? Lieutenant Mike Pooley and the chief now saying that when Mr. Dalvin Hollins, 19-year-old Dalvin Hollins, robbed the Walgreens at rural in Guadalupe, that he made a gesture that he had a gun, he robbed it for narcotics, and then as he was being chased by police, pointed what they believed to be a gun when the lieutenant fired the single fatal shot as he was in the parking lot of a senior living facility. He died from that injury, and now we're still waiting to figure out how this will play out as the investigation is underway, but wanted to bring you that coverage live. We're going to take a quick break, and we'll be right back.
We will continue to release information.